Still on? Okay. Sounds like it's on. Yay. All right, we are in Daniel chapter 8 tonight. And if you haven't grabbed one already, there's a handout on this folding chair back here if you would like to have one. You're welcome to it, or you can take notes on your own. That's what I heard. All righty, let's see if we can get started. It's close enough to 5 o'clock. We're in Daniel chapter 8 tonight, and I have wrestled with how I want to do this one. You know, at the tail end of this chapter, Daniel got sick, and he was sick for 7 days. Well, I didn't say 7 days, but he was sick for several days. And you can ask Peggy, I've been sick over this one. And not just this one, but the next 2 or 3 are looking even worse. But anyway, we'll get through it. Unlike last week when I could not declare who the horn was, this week I can. So that's always kind of nice. You have a feeling like you've accomplished something. So in your handout, the next to the last page there is a drawing that shows Nebuchadnezzar's dream, the statue that was there, and then there's also chapter 7, Daniel's vision, and then there's chapter 8, the one we're in tonight, Daniel's vision. They're all overlaid with a timeline along the right side. I'm going to give you some dates probably here after a while, but one that I think is really important, and I'm going to go to that one now, since I almost started at the tail end of this thing and worked backwards anyway. But up at the top of your timeline there, put above that timeline 740 BC. And you can write Isaiah next to that. Isaiah, at least according to my Bible and a couple commentaries that I read, Isaiah was written approximately 740 BC, give or take. In 740 BC, Isaiah quotes God in chapter 44, verse 28, and it goes on through chapter 45, verse 6, but it basically says, "Who is Cyrus? He is my shepherd and will accomplish all that I please. He will say of Jerusalem, let it be rebuilt. And of the temple, let its foundations be laid." And that is essentially what Cyrus did when Cyrus was the king. Cyrus captured Babylon in 539 BC. Quick math, that is 200 years prior to Cyrus showing up on the scene that God has declared through Isaiah, Cyrus will do it. How about you? Well, I'm pretty impressed with that. Most of us have trouble predicting what's going to happen tomorrow. But God lays out 200 years in advance this guy named Cyrus. Who is Cyrus? No, nobody's heard of Cyrus at that point. Matter of fact, the Medes and the Persians were not powers at the time Isaiah was declaring this. The Assyrians were coming on pretty strong. And soon the Babylonians would. But not the Persians. They were yet to be heard of. The Medes were getting better, and they would come on the scene a little bit before the Persians. But 740 BC, God declares it. For the sake of my Jacob, my servant, of Israel, my chosen, I have summoned you by name and bestow on you a title of honor, though you have not acknowledged me. He readily admits way up front, Cyrus is not even going to acknowledge him as being God, but he is going to do this because I said he's going to do this. And he's going to do this when I say he's going to do this. And lo and behold, Cyrus does when he gets on the throne. He is a benevolent leader, and he tells all the captives in all the provinces, go home. The Assyrians were bad about bringing people from other countries to their land and then transplanting other people into the land that they had just vacated. The Babylonians took up on that too, and they did exactly the same kind of thing. And Cyrus there, he says, go back home. If you want to go back home, go back home. And a bunch of people did. Who is Cyrus? He is my shepherd, and he will accomplish all that I please. He will say of Jerusalem, let the walls be built. He will say of the temple, let the foundation be laid. And it was. Well, the last couple of weeks we've talked about visions and dreams that predict the future. And primarily the four kingdoms that would follow, starting with Babylon, all the way through to the fourth kingdom that we identified as being Rome. See, the good thing about this is we have history on our side and we can look back. We know how it fell into place. So we can say, when he says kingdom 1, kingdom 2, kingdom 3, kingdom 4, we can say who it was because we know. Daniel didn't know. The Jews did not know. But this was written for their edification. It was written to encourage them. It was written to strengthen them. So anyway, back to where we start. I just want to lay that one on you in case we never get to it. But it was the third year of Belshazzar. And I, Daniel, had a vision after the one that had appeared to me previously, that was in the first year of Belshazzar, in chapter 7. In my vision, I saw myself in the citadel of Susa, the province of Elam. In the vision, I was beside Uliah Canal, and that was a canal that ran through the town and then kind of dumped into the united Tigris and Euphrates River. So this would be approximately 551 BC. Daniel would be 69 years old at this time. And he is in Susa or Shushan, depending on your translation. It's a city that's about 200 miles southwest of Babylon. But at the time of his vision, it was not anything to be bragged about. It was just a town. It would later become the capital of the Medo-Persian Empire. But it wasn't at that time. So similar to others, he probably did not travel to Susa, but rather he was there by God, just as Ezekiel was transported to Jerusalem in Ezekiel 8 and in Ezekiel 10. And the Apostle John was transported to the wilderness in Revelation 17:3, and he was transported to a high mountain in Revelation 21:10. Same way with him. God put him where he wanted him, in the future capital of Persia, not the then capital. This city was translated, I guess, means lily. And this is where Daniel had one of his visions. It's also where Nehemiah began his public life, and I think spent time in exile there. It is also where the book of Esther mostly takes place, under Artaxerxes. So this is an important town, though it's not an important town when Daniel visits it. It is going to be an important town once upon a time. So Cyrus the Great reigned from 550 BC to 529 BC. He established the Persian Empire. He made Shushan his capital, or Susa, depending on your translation. Then Darius the Great came in sometime later, 521 to 540 or 586 BC, and he built a magnificent palace there. And it's this palace that was occupied by Artaxerxes II, who is believed to be the one that married Esther, promoted her to queen, and all the book of Esther, you see, basically takes place in this town that we're talking about. And we already mentioned that. Nehemiah exile there. Daniel had his vision there. So Daniel encounters two animals in his vision. In verse 3 it says, I looked up and there before me was a ram with two horns standing beside the canal, and horns were long. One of the horns was longer than the other, but it grew up later. I watched the ram as it charged east or westward and north and south. No animal could stand against him. None could rescue from his power. He did as he pleased, and he became great. It's similar to what we saw in the vision last time with the bear, where it was kind of raised up on one side. One part of this kingdom is stronger than the other, and it represents, as we're going to find out, Gabriel's going to tell Daniel, this is the Medo-Persian Empire, and the Persian side of this is much stronger, hence the bigger horn. But then suddenly I saw a goat with a prominent horn between its eyes coming from the west, crossing over the whole earth without touching the ground. He came toward the two-horned ram I had seen standing by the canal and charged at him with great rage. I saw him attack the ram furiously, striking the ram and shattering the two horns. The ram was powerless to stand against him. The goat knocked him to the ground, trampled on him, and none could rescue the ram from his power. The goat became very great, but at the height of his power, the large horn was broken off, and in its place, 4 prominent horns grew toward the 4 winds. What does the horn represent? Right? I mean, that's the natural thing. Well, for animals, it represented power and virility. So to have the horn broken off meant the power left. And hence, when the ram lost the horns, it was powerless. So the power was taken away, basically. And then the goat was able to trample it. And immediately then, the goat establishes world power, but this single horn that he's got between his eyes is broken off. Now, having looked at these other visions before, you kind of get the idea that's probably Greece. Alexander the Great. And in a 10-year period, he basically conquered the world. But after that, he died. Right at the height of his power, he died. He was only 32 years of age. And then things were kind of sorted between the 4 generals. They took the deal. So you got 4 little horns that start growing up where there had been before. Figuratively, God is the horn of salvation to those who believe in him. 2 Samuel 22:3, Psalm 18:2 both mention the horn of salvation. So he is the power. When he says he's the horn of salvation, he is the power of our salvation. Luke 1:67 through 71, Zechariah. Now, Zechariah had encountered Gabriel, the very same guy, hopefully. I don't know. I always wondered about that. There were like 5 Davids in my first grade class, and I got to know there's 4 or 5 of us around here too, right? I don't know that Gabriel was the only Gabriel around, but let's assume that Gabriel was the only Gabriel angel that there is. I don't know. There may be a bunch of Gabriels up there. But there was a Gabriel that encountered Zechariah, and if you remember, Zechariah kind of questioned him. He says, well, I got an idea for you. You can just be quiet until your baby's born. So he came out of the temple and he couldn't talk. Nobody knew what happened, right? Well, when the baby is born, and his first words out of his mouth is, you can call him John. Then he turns around and he prophesies. It says the Holy Spirit came on him in Luke 1:67 with the Holy Ghost or Holy Spirit and prophesied, praise be to the Lord, the God of Israel, because he has come and redeemed his people. He has raised a horn of salvation for us in the house of his servant David. The horn of salvation, of course, in that case refers to Jesus, the one who is coming. As he said through his holy prophets long ago, salvation from our enemies, from the hands of those who hate us. Other examples, the first one I've got there probably says 1 Samuel 12:1. It's not. It's 1 Samuel 2:1, and also verse 10, and then Psalm 18:2, Psalm 89:17, Psalm 132:17, and Ezekiel 29:21. So what did he see next? He says, out of one of them came another horn. So he's still talking about the goat, because the ram has already been destroyed. The goat lost the major horn, Alexander the Great. Now he has 4 horns, but out of one of them comes another horn, which started small but grew power to the south and to the east and toward the beautiful land. So you kind of got to wonder, well, what's the beautiful land? Well, the beautiful land tends out to be most likely Palestine. Daniel 11:16 and 11:41. It's called the beautiful land in the NIV and the New American Standard, and the glorious land in the ESV and the New King James. And in Ezekiel, where Ezekiel 20 verse 6 says, on that day I swore to them I would bring them out of Egypt to a land that I had searched out for them, a land flowing with milk and honey, the most beautiful of all the lands. And Ezekiel 20:15 and 16, also with uplifted hand I swore to them in the desert I would not bring them into the land that I had given them, a land flowing with milk and honey, the most beautiful of all lands, because they had rejected my law, followed my decrees, desecrated my Sabbaths, for their hearts were devoted to idols. So sin has gotten them in trouble before. Sin's going to get them in trouble again. But this one horn goes in different directions here, including toward Palestine. It grew until it reached the host of heavens. That's probably most likely regarded to as being God's people. And it threw some of these starry hosts down onto the earth and trampled them. In other words, he killed them. It set itself up against the great prince of the host. Most likely that translates as God. It took away the daily sacrifice. That was the morning and the evening sacrifice in the temple. And the place of his sanctuary was brought low. The sanctuary was desecrated. An altar of Zeus was brought in, and they sacrificed a pig in there. I mean, they did everything that they could to desecrate the temple. But verse 12 says, this was because of your rebellion. This was because of the sin of the children of Israel that brought all this on. God does not overlook sin. The host armies, Israel's, and the daily sacrifice were given over to it. So what used to be a sacrifice, now they could not sacrifice. It wasn't allowed. They wouldn't allow any of that. It prospered in everything it did, and truth was thrown to the ground. Truth being the law of Moses. Where they found scrolls of the law, it was burned. If you were in bad news. So Daniel's kind of confused, and he looks around and he's wondering, what am I going to do? Verse 15, while I, Daniel, was watching the vision, trying to understand it, there stood before me one who looked like a man, and I heard the voice of a man who was over the water, calling, Gabriel, tell this man the meaning of the vision. So Daniel sees somebody that is over the water. Some of your versions say between the banks. Well, he's either standing in the water or he's over the water, right? I think he's over the water, just kind of hovering there. Something you can do as an angel, maybe. I don't know. But he's hovering over the water, and he tells Gabriel, tell this guy the meaning of the vision. And he came near to the place where I was standing. I was terrified, fell prostrate. Son of man, he says to me, you human. That's what he's saying. You human. And it's interesting, too, because Gabriel means man of God, hero of God, or conqueror of God, champion of God. So this is the hero of God, champion of God, talking to the Son of Man. A title, of course, as we pointed out before, is over and over in Ezekiel, talking about Ezekiel or to Ezekiel. He uses it of himself. God uses it of him. But then Jesus, of course, uses it of himself in the New Testament. So anyway, he's letting him know, you're human, I'm not. Understand the vision concerns the time of the end. When he was speaking to me, I was in a deep sleep. With my face to the ground, he touched me and raised me to my feet. He said, I'm going to tell you what will happen later in the time of wrath, because the vision concerns the appointed time of the end. So Gabriel's going to lay all this out to him. one other thing about Gabriel, when he was talking with Zechariah, Zechariah asked him who he was, and he says, I am Gabriel who stands in the presence of God, Luke 1:19. So it's not just an angel, but one rather that stands in the presence of God. Matthew 7:7-8. Ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be open. For everyone who asks receives. He who seeks finds. And he who knocks, the door is open. And that is exactly what Daniel did. He was crying out for somebody to point him in the right direction. And two angels, I think. One we don't know the name of, but the second one, Gabriel, says, come on, Gabriel, tell him the meaning of this vision. Let him know what's going on here. So he does. If any of you lacks wisdom, he should ask God, James 1:4-8. So, Gabriel says, verse 20, the two-horned ram that you saw represents the kings of Media and Persia. So there you go. All these others, we have looked back in history and assumed this is who it was based on what we know of history. Now, this erased all doubt about this kingdom. Gabriel says this is the Medo-Persian Empire represented by this ram. The shaggy goat is the king of Greece. Erases all doubt about who the second kingdom is or what the second kingdom is. It's Greece. The large horn, of course, being Alexander the Great. And then the ones that come out, the four after that, the four generals that kind of divvied up his territory after Alexander died, an untimely death. So the four horns replace the one that was broken off, and they represent the four kingdoms that will emerge from his nation. But they will not have the same power. And they didn't. There was a lot of infighting that was going on. So if you look at your handout, I've already told you, kind of pointed it to you there, but Daniel chapter 2, the statue with a head of gold, the chest and arms of silver, the belly and thighs of bronze. We had said before, well, in that case, Daniel very clearly tells Nebuchadnezzar, head of gold, that's you. So we had a starting place. Head of gold, that was Nebuchadnezzar. After that, we were guessing based on history. Next one, the silver, that belonged to the Medo-Persian Empire. And then the bronze belonged to the Greek Empire. And then legs of iron, feet mixed, iron mixed with clay. You notice I added that to that little drawing there. Crushes and shatters their kingdoms, were deemed unworthy by the judge, and they were destroyed. But the Son of Man was ruled to be worthy and had dominion, all rule, and all power. And even though there was persecution that was going to take place, God's eternal kingdom, a heavenly kingdom, not of this earth, would be established, and there was nothing they could do about it. So, how does Gabriel go about explaining the later days? In the later part of their reign, we're talking about these four generals here. When the rebels have become completely wicked, a stern-faced king, a master of intrigue will arise. He will become very strong, but not, and this is important, not of his own power. A lot of times kings get the idea, we're doing this on our own. It's all me. Not what Daniel's vision said. That's not what Gabriel said. He didn't do it on his own. God is the one that propped this guy up to allow him to do all the despicable things that he did. Why? Because verse 12, because of transgressions, because of their sin. He will cause astounding devastation and will succeed in whatever he does. He will destroy the mighty men, that is the Israel army, and the holy people, the priest. So he's going to destroy them. As a matter of fact, he puts in people to be priests, and then others buy the priesthood. I mean, it's a really mess with all of this stuff in here. His deceit will prosper. He will continue to consider himself superior. When they feel secure, he will destroy many and take his stand against the Prince of Princes, that's God. Yet he will be destroyed, but not by human power. He will not die on the battlefield. He will not die by assassination. He will die because God snuffed life out of him. He was propped up by God. He was taken out by God. So if you look at history, the rule of the Medes and Persians is interesting because the Medes, they were east of Babylon. They kind of waxed and waned as far as go through the centuries. But in about 540 BC, a king named Cyrus came to the throne of Persia. It was a small realm, and they were paying tribute to the Medes at that time. But within 10 years, the Medo-Persian Empire was kind of put together subject to Cyrus. Within 20 years, by the time he was 60, he had conquered Babylon and taken control of most of the eastern world. Some 200 years later, the Medo-Persian Empire had expanded so much that it was from Ethiopia to India. And that you can find that Esther 1, verse 1. The Greeks alone were the problem child for the Medo-Persians. They could not get after Greece. Every time they launched a battle against these city-states that were in Greece, they lost the battle. But they kept trying. They say it was embarrassing that the Greeks were unbeatable to these guys. Darius was defeated by the Greeks. Xerxes lost his navy to the Greeks. Artaxerxes was defeated by the Greeks. So on and on it gets. But the Greeks posed little threat to them because they were a motley assortment of city-states. They weren't united. Until about the mid-4th century when Philip came on the scene. Philip of Macedonia, and he started gathering first wealth, then hiring mercenaries, and he and his generals developed battle tactics that nobody could withstand. So he marched over Greece first. So he kind of united Macedonia and Greece. But he was assassinated in 336, and Alexander, his son, took over. He was barely 20 years old. But within 2 years, he had control of Asia. Within 10 years, he and his generals had taken every bit of the world that really mattered at that point. So he just kind of walked over everything. But after that 10-year period, he up and dies at 32 years of age. The large horn was broken off. After he died, his kingdom was divided amongst his generals. Antipater had Macedonia and Greece, or what we normally call Greece these days. Lysimachus, I guess that is how you say it, had Thrace and Asia Minor. So that's Turkey, basically, and the isthmus that goes across there. Seleucus had Syria and Mesopotamia, and Ptolemy had Egypt and Palestine. And when Palestine was under Ptolemy and that Ptolemy line, everything was fine, life was good. But Seleucus, at the point, it was actually Antiochus Iv, decided he wanted Egypt, and so he took Egypt and Palestine from Ptolemy. He was not a good guy. And life became tough for the folks in Israel. But he was succeeded by Antiochus IV. Antiochus IV was a really bad guy. And he is the one believed to be, by most commentators, this horn that comes up. He gave himself the name Epiphanes, which means illustrious manifestation. He claimed to be the epiphany of God. He even had coins minted with the word theos on there for God. It's God's coin. He had a passionate desire to turn the Jews into Greeks. One of the first acts that he did was to drive out the high priest, an ardent Jew, and replace him with Jason, a patron of the Greeks. Jason was then replaced by Melius, who had bribed his way into the priesthood. But Melius had the bad luck of thinking that the king was killed in another round down in Egypt. He was still trying to fight it out in Egypt. So he decided to try to take over Palestine. But the king heard something was going on. He came running back, took him out, and also killed, about 20,000 of the folks there in Jerusalem. And he attacked on a Sabbath and desecrated the place. He was also prohibited the Jews from honoring the Sabbath, practicing circumcision, offering sacrifices in the temple, obeying the Levitical dietary law. Climax of his campaign was in December 168 BC when he replaced the Jewish altar with the altar of Zeus and sacrificed a pig on it. They built a gymnasium in Jerusalem, which is where they did all their wrestling and that kind of stuff. And they wrestled, as Blake pointed out here a while back, in the nude. So the Jews, so as to not appear to be non-Greek, had surgery to repair their circumcisions, to appear that they had not been circumcised. So they're doing, this guy is a really bad guy. I mean, he's taking these guys way down the path, you know. He's desecrating the temple. He's forbidding the morning and the evening sacrifice. He's forbidding, anybody that goes near the temple was either turned away, or if they maintained they were going to the temple, they were just executed. If they were found with a copy of the law was burned and they were executed. This is a bad guy. Really a bad guy. Eventually, the folks that wanted anything to do with the law of Moses started gathering together under the Maccabees. Judas Maccabee, kind of the leader of that group, and they then kind of declared war on the Greeks. And for about 3 years, about 168 to 165, they proceeded to earn their freedom. For almost 100 years, Israel was free until the Romans marched in and took everything in 63 BC. So from about 165 BC to 63 BC, they were their own little country. Life was good. And the Maccabees really thought, hey, Messiah's coming. This is the deal. We proved our power. We can do it. The rededication of the temple occurred in December of 165. And there was a feast that is celebrated that we know as Hanukkah, which is a transliteration of the Hebrew word for dedication. The temple was rededicated, hence that is the name of their feast. You'll find that Jesus celebrates that apparently in John 10, verse 22. We know it also as the Feast of Lights because there was the story that there was only like a day's worth of oil left for the candle or for the lamp, and it burned 7 days. So they call it also the Feast of Lights. But it was the celebration basically of rededicating the temple. Antiochus IV went mad while in Persia and died in 163. Not by human power, but divine judgment took him out. God had propped him up to serve his purposes, and then God took him out. So who is the little horn? Well, almost invariably everybody to a person agrees Antiochus IV Epiphanes is the most likely suspect for being the little horn that grew out of the four horns on that goat. So what did Gabriel instruct Daniel to do with this vision? He says, the vision of the evening and the mornings has been given to you. It is true. Seal up the vision, for it concerns distant future. Folks have kind of wrestled with that one. What is he talking about here? Well, most folks think he's talking about protecting it. You've got something that foretells the future here. You need to protect it. You wrap it up. You put your seal on it so nobody can get it. But then you're going to pass it around to the Jews. They want to know. They need to know God has predicted the future here. God's watching out for them here, and God is going to take out all of this stuff. He's going to put you back where you belong, but there's some payment that you're going to have to make in the meantime because of your sin. Guess what happens next chapter? Next chapter, Daniel's going to start praying about the sin of himself and the sin of the nation, asking God to remember and to put them back in place. So the contents of this vision were to be available for generations to come because it's going to be 400 years from the time that Daniel gives this vision to the time of Antiochus Epiphanes shows up. 400 years. I was impressed when Isaiah did 200 years to call Cyrus by name. Now, he didn't call him by name, but he nailed it 400 years in advance. I, Daniel, was exhausted and I lay ill for several days. When I got up, I went about the king's business. I was appalled by the vision. It was beyond understanding. The NIV, ESV, and RSV all say appalled. The New American Standard says astounded. New King James and the King James say astonished. And the Amplified says wondered. You remember what happened last time? The last vision? It was almost the same kind of thing, right? He was just absolutely overcome to know the future. To know the future of the sin, to know the future of the suffering, and to know the future of God putting things back the way God wanted them. Daniel's little personal note, exhausted and sick for days. He was considered favored by God, and he'll say that in the next 2 chapters. Gabriel greets him as one favored by God. He was favored by God to know the future, but the sight didn't necessarily please him. And I wonder if you and I were given that kind of glimpse into the future, how it would affect us. Aren't you glad that God has not done that for us? He hasn't given us that kind of view into the future. Instead, he's given us really just about 2 views into the future. The first is in John 14, where Jesus says, you believe in God, you believe also in me. For in my Father's house are many mansions. And I'm going to prepare a place for you. And if I go, I'm coming back to get you so that you can be where I am too. And then in Revelation 21, where he describes something that's just absolutely unbelievable. And that's with human words. It's beyond understanding. It's beyond comprehension. It's beyond what we can put into words. I like that view of the future. I don't need to know all this other stuff. I'm kind of like the commentators that I read. I don't think we could handle it. The emotional impact on Daniel was tremendous. I think it would be on us too. He didn't really have a clear understanding of this total vision, so maybe it shouldn't distress us if we don't get it all just right too. But I think we understand enough of it to know exactly what's going on here. Heavy burden, it's a worry about sin, it's a worry about suffering. Romans, probably, if you just kind of look at it, there were 2 important things that came. The Greeks put in a language that was universal. Koine Greek, the common language Greek, went universal. That was necessary, I think, for the New Testament. And the Romans came in and put in a transportation system that was just out of this world. And that, I think, was critical to the spreading of the gospel. Those 2 things, I think, were the positive side of the Greek and the Roman Empire. About prophecies, well, I gave you the big one right up front with Isaiah. But I mean, it's no less if you go to 2 Kings 24 and 25, Nebuchadnezzar is attacking Judah. Judah's king Zedekiah sends word to Jeremiah and says, hey, we going to make out all right? Jeremiah sends him a note back. Jeremiah 21 and 22 says, no, it ain't going to work. You might as well surrender. Jeremiah 25, he says it's going to be 70 years. Daniel remembers that. Daniel reads that. And in his prayer next week, he calls that to God's attention. 70 years in this Babylonian captivity. 70 years, Jeremiah 25, 10 through 12. And also Jeremiah 29, 10 through 14. 70 years. Nebuchadnezzar's vision in chapter 2 was in 604 or 603 BC, and yet it talked about the heavenly kingdom that was coming in about, 30 AD? Yeah, that's 400 years in advance. Daniel's vision in chapter 7 in 553 BC, the 4 major kingdoms and the fact that there would be a heavenly kingdom established at that time, that's 400 years. Daniel's vision here in chapter 8 that we just looked at was in 551 BC, and it's still 10 to 12 years out before the Medo-Persian Empire would come in, Cyrus would come in and take out Nebuchadnezzar. And at that time, the Greeks hadn't even been thought of. They weren't really a country. They were just a bunch of ragtag city-states. The Maccabean revolt and control came from 160 BC to about 63 BC, an independent state. So what should we learn? What should we apply? The precision with which God declares the future events of history stand as great proof of inspiration. How could Daniel know about the things that these kings would not exist until many years after his own time? He could only know because of divine revelation. That's the only way. God did not convey this information to Daniel simply for his great knowledge. He did so to help his people. The Jews needed to know that a time of crisis was coming, even if it was going to be 4 centuries in the future. But God is in control. Thank you very much for your attention tonight, and we'll pick up next week with a prayer. Daniel chapter 9.